ValuJet was a company which, to put it simply, was a train wreck of an American airline. Between the years of 1993 and 1997, the airline became infamous for its terrible safety record and lack of any progress to address significant problems at the airline, even once pilots and flight attendants had walked away from their jobs out of safety concerns. Certain officials at the Federal Aviation Administration wanted the airline grounded from as early as 1994. On May 11, 1996, ValuJet Flight 592 crashed into the Florida Everglades, killing 110 people. It was revealed that an onboard fire had occurred after hazardous cargo had been inappropriately stored in the cargo hold. What was on board the plane, and what were the shortcomings of the airline which contributed to the accident? On October 26, 1993, the then new budget airline ValuJet began operations. ValuJet was one of many airlines which had sprung up in the United States around this time. A low-cost airline boom in the country had given air travelers a lot of choice when traveling by air. As a low-cost carrier, ValuJet purchased older planes which other airlines had phased out of their fleets. The plane most abundant in their fleet was the McDonnell Douglas DC-9. The DC-9 had long since been a staple of American domestic operations across the country. Over 900 of these planes were produced between the years of 1965 and 1982. By the 1990s, the plane had become more antiquated. As such, the DC-9 became a go-to choice for low-cost carriers looking for cheap second-hand aircraft. The DC-9, even though a popular plane in its day, was not without incident. The plane itself was infamous for the fact that over 15% of the planes that were ever built had been lost over the years, with over 3,500 fatalities. ValuJet operated a total of 44 of these planes. ValuJet, as an airline, had been embroiled in controversy for most of its life. The airline had reportedly boasted about how little they pay their workers. They forced their pilots to pay for their own flight training at the airline, gave flight attendants only minimal training, and demanded exceedingly long hours from their employees. They had been involved in lawsuits with airlines such as TWA and Delta over landing slots, and outsourced a lot of the groundwork that airlines would normally operate themselves, such as maintenance. Although ValuJet did have some in-house maintenance facilities at their base in Atlanta, in Miami for example, some ground services were outsourced to a company called SabreTech. In the 12 months before the accident of Flight 592, 2 ValuJet DC-9 planes were involved in major incidents. In June 1995, ValuJet Flight 597 suffered a catastrophic uncontained engine failure after an aborted takeoff in Atlanta, which resulted in a major cabin fire. The cause was damaged internal engine parts. The plane was destroyed in the incident with no fatalities. ValuJet had been aware of the problem but did not address the issue due to a lack of a budget to fix the engines, but intentionally kept the plane flying despite this. 7 months later, in January 1996, another ValuJet DC-9, this time at Nashville, Tennessee, had suffered an excessively hard landing due to pilot error which had injured 5 people. Among other maintenance anomalies at the airline, another ValuJet plane had reportedly made a total of 140 flights with a hydraulic system which was prone to leaking before it was ever fixed. Between 1994 and the day of the accident of Flight 592, there had been 129 emergency landings made at ValuJet. ValuJet had the poorest safety record in the United States, with an older fleet than most other airlines, including its competitors and legacy carriers. Flying out of its base in Atlanta, Georgia, a ValuJet DC-9 plane is making a trip on May 11, 1996 to Miami, Florida. The plane, registered as November 904 Victor Juliet, was 28 years old in 1996 and was first delivered to Delta Airlines all the way back in May of 1969. Delta operated the plane up until 1992, before the airline sold it back to McDonnell Douglas. The plane was then sold to ValuJet in 1993. Whilst in operation at ValuJet, the plane had suffered numerous complications in the 2 years leading up to the incident of Flight 592. These had included 8 recorded emergency landings. By the time of the accident, it had accumulated 68,000 flight hours, with over 80,000 flight cycles. Piloting the plane was Captain Candlin Kubek, age 35. From California, she had just under 9,000 total flying hours, over 2,000 of which were in the DC-9. Her co-pilot on the day was Richard Hazen, serving as first officer. At 52 years old, he had nearly 12,000 flying hours. Alongside his captain, he too has roughly the same amount of time logged in the DC-9. Once arriving in Miami, the plane was delayed for just over an hour due to mechanical problems with the plane. This was on top of the fact that the plane was also delayed from leaving Atlanta earlier in the day due to unexpected maintenance involving the circuit breaker for the right auxiliary hydraulic pump. The left fuel flow gauge was also reported to be inoperable. For days at this point, the autopilot had been defective on this plane as reported by other pilots. Earlier in the day, before the trip to Miami on a flight into Atlanta, the intercom system which allows the pilots to communicate with the flight attendants in the cabin had broken and was now inoperative. The public address system had then also broke on the flight prior to Flight 592 into Miami from Atlanta. The passengers on that flight later revealed that the cabin crew resorted to using a megaphone to perform their basic duties. A SabreTech mechanic in Miami was called to the plane during the turnaround to try and troubleshoot the problems with the plane. These issues could not be fixed in Miami, and the plane was given the OK to continue flying. 105 passengers embarked the DC-9 plane. Along with the 2 flight crew members, there were also 3 flight attendants for a total of 110 people on board. As well as the passengers' baggage, Flight 592 will also be taking some extra cargo for the flight to Atlanta. This included 3 DC-9 landing gear tires and 5 cardboard boxes which were labelled as company materials, or COMAT for short. These boxes contained 144 chemical oxygen generators. The purpose of these generators are to supply oxygen to passengers in the event that the oxygen masks would be needed. They had originated from a purchase of 150 of these generators by ValuJet. As a passenger pulls on their oxygen mask, it pulls a firing pin on the generator which provides enough energy to start a chemical reaction to create oxygen, which then flows out of the container. Once activated, the casing of these generators can become extremely hot, reaching temperatures of over 250 degrees Celsius. To safely stow these generators, a safety cap needs to be attached to prevent any accidental activation of the firing pin. Documentation on how to do this was provided to SabreTech by ValuJet. These oxygen generators had come from previous planes, and were not properly stored with the correct protective measures in place. 144 of these generators were then placed into cardboard boxes and left in a shipping area on SabreTech's grounds, with no markings or anything to identify them or their contents, or even be labelled with the fact that these items were hazardous. In the days before the accident of Flight 592, they had been sitting in a holding area for ValuJet property at SabreTech in Miami. On May 8th, a store clerk at SabreTech had arranged with the director of logistics to transport the boxes of generators to Atlanta as they had become clutter in the holding area, and expecting an audit, they wanted these boxes moved elsewhere. The oxygen generators had then been repackaged, with around 2 to 3 inches of bubble wrap on the top of each of the contents of the boxes. The boxes were then labelled as ValuJet COMAT as aircraft parts. According to the store clerk, these boxes stayed at the SabreTech store where they were until the day of the accident on May 11th. The paperwork was then filled out to describe the contents of the boxes. The oxygen generators were identified as empty. The clerk who had packaged the generators did not even know what they were, as none of the mechanics had told them what was inside. They saw that they had green tags attached to them, and then assumed that had meant that they were empty. In reality, these oxygen generators were not empty. The generators had been packed in a way that made accidental activation much more likely, as following the accident, many of the inactivated generators were found with unsatisfactory securing measures. ValuJet supposedly had a hazardous materials policy, in where they state that the airline would not engage in the transportation of any hazardous goods. There were some items with exceptions. Chemical oxygen generators were not on that list of allowable items. The 5 cardboard boxes containing the 144 oxygen generators were then loaded onto ValuJet Flight 592 on May 11th, where they had been loaded into the forward cargo compartment. The ramp agent had gotten the flight crew to sign off on the cargo that was being loaded into the cargo hold, without ever knowing the exact condition of the oxygen generators. The forward cargo compartment on this aircraft was classified as a Class D compartment. This classification of a compartment had meant that it was airtight. Any fire that would occur in these cargo holds are supposed to burn out once oxygen is exhausted. Smoke and fire detection was not mandatory in these cargo holds at the time. After the lengthy delay in Miami, Flight 592 left the gate at around 1:40 p.m. and taxied out to runway 9 left. At 2:03, air traffic control cleared Flight 592 for takeoff. The first few minutes of the departure went as expected. In the forward cargo compartment, however, it is believed that one of the improperly packaged oxygen generators which was loaded onto the plane had activated and a fire had begun in the cargo hold. For a fire to occur and spread, there needs to be a fuel source, which in the case of Flight 592 could have been anything in the cargo hold that was flammable, such as the cardboard boxes which the oxygen generators were stored in. The nearby tires, which were also loaded into the same cargo hold, would also have been extremely flammable, and would have produced excessive noxious smoke. Heat is another key component of fire. The heat would have been generated by the high temperatures, which the casing of the oxygen generators can achieve once activated. A fire also needs a supply of oxygen. In the case of ValuJet Flight 592, it's rather obvious where this oxygen supply would be coming from. Because of the lack of any smoke detection equipment, it is unknown on exactly when the fire had actually started. It was not until 2:10 p.m. when the pilots knew that something was wrong, when an explosion was heard on the flight deck. The investigation believed that by 2:10 p.m., the fire had already escaped the cargo compartment below, but had not quite burned its way through to the cabin just yet. The explosion that was heard was one of the tires in the forward cargo compartment exploding. This had meant that the fire had been raging for several minutes without anyone knowing. Had the cargo hold been equipped with fire detection equipment, it could have bought the pilots several minutes of valuable time. Instead, by the time that they knew that there was a danger on board, it was already at a crisis point. The fire had begun burning its way through the ceiling of the cargo hold and the flooring of the cabin, where crucial aircraft wiring runs through. Captain Candlin Kubek identified an electrical problem with the plane. Seconds later, on the cockpit voice recorder, sounds from the cabin can be heard as fire and smoke had become visible in the cabin. The sounds of panicked passengers could also be heard. The flight crew called for a return to Miami Airport with air traffic control, less than a minute after a problem first came to their attention. A cabin crew member entered the cockpit requesting that the passenger oxygen masks be deployed. The onboard fire is burning its way through the flight controls. At 2:11 and 38 seconds, Captain Kubek then asks for the nearest possible airport, probably knowing that arrival at Miami is looking ever more unlikely. This was the last radio message from the plane. It is likely that noxious smoke had filled the cabin and cockpit, which left the pilots unconscious. The cockpit voice recorder then only captured the sounds of the air rushing against the plane and the audio tones from aircraft systems. Radio messages from the tower now go unanswered. The cockpit voice recorder ceases at 2:13 and 25 seconds, less than 3.5 minutes after the pilots first knew that the plane was on fire. ValuJet Flight 592 crashed into the Florida Everglades in a nose-down position. The crash had killed 110 people. The plane had only been in the air for about 10 minutes before it crashed. The investigation from the National Transportation Safety Board in the United States determined that the probable cause of the crash was a fire in the cargo hold, which had originated from the activation of one or more of the chemical oxygen generators which had been improperly packaged and loaded onto the plane. ValuJet had failed to oversee activities at SabreTech. SabreTech surrendered their operating license and closed. The airline also failed to ensure compliance with maintenance training and hazardous materials requirements and practices, to quote the accident report. Blame was also directed at the Federal Aviation Administration for not requiring fire and smoke detection equipment to be installed on all classifications of cargo compartments. The FAA was also accused of not appropriately monitoring maintenance practices of ValuJet, or the airline's oversight of its subsequent contractors such as SabreTech. In the aftermath of the accident, the aggressive cost-cutting business practices of ValuJet and other low-cost carriers came under scrutiny. The FAA grounded ValuJet on June 11, 1996. The airline did resume operations on September 26th of that year, but with a much reduced fleet after complying with FAA requirements. Heavy negative publicity meant that the airline was in financial ruin. ValuJet quietly merged with another airline and became AirTran without much publicity, where that airline operated until 2014, before it was acquired by Southwest Airlines. ValuJet as an airline was never prosecuted. This left many outraged with how poor the airline's safety record was, including the relatives of the victims of Flight 592. It should be noted that the CEO of ValuJet is still in the airline business, despite their airline failing to adequately perform its duties to protect their passengers. He is currently the CEO of Allegiant Air, another low-cost airline which itself has had its own string of incidents in its years of operation. Hello everyone, thanks once again for making it to the end of this video. I do hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy this video, don't forget to subscribe as I upload videos every Saturday. I'm thinking sometime soon on making a video that is on a non-aviation incident, as some people have requested. It may take another couple of weeks or so for that to be done, but it is something I am working on. Anyway, I would like to thank my patrons from Patreon once again for their generous support. If you'd like to have your name featured or read out at the end of the next video, you can sign up to my Patreon from £3 per month. Link to that will be in the pinned comment. So a thank you to my £5 patrons, Aidan Montgomery, D. Rogers, Hector Palmer-Tellez, KTP123, Ken Zachman, Murray Ennis, and WrongTrack58. A very big thanks to my generous £10 patrons for their continued support, Cherub, Daniel Hendricks, Side Effect, and Will Tanner. And that is it from me this week. I hope you have a great weekend, whatever it is you're doing, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.